Thank you for that introduction, Megan. Yeah, that's pretty wonderful. So today I wanted to talk about how LANDFIRE existing vegetation type contributes to our estimation of forage and seasonal range of mule deer in Idaho. And I got to start off by kind of acknowledging my co-authors, Rob Ritson, who might be here, Aaron Rush, who's my direct supervisor, Mark Hurley, who I had the privilege of working with for a decade or so, who actually helped develop some of these ideas and bring them into fruition, and then our research manager, Matt Muma. So basically, for the talk outline today, basically I'm going to talk about mule deer and some of their spatial temporal life histories and their seasonal movements. And then this work that I'll be presenting today on mule deer also encompasses pronghorn antelope and elk too. Kind of take a deep dive into land composition from 2001 to 2023 and some of the products that existing vegetation type provides the opportunity for our analysis here. Then we're going to get into some of the seasonal modeling distribution, how we incorporate deer movements, the time, and then how we transmogrify the existing vegetation type into forage. And we're going to start to look at seasonal range also through time. This traditionally we're used to more static measurements, little red polygons on map that will say this is winter or summer range. But some of our use with these developing these regional range models show that might be wrong. And then finally, on some of Megan's advice, I'm going to go through a couple of problems and hurdles that we see within using the EVT data set, and not just using the most current one, but we use this through time. So 2001 products all the way up to the current ones. Mule deer within Idaho are a seasonally migratory species. This makes it a little bit harder to track them when we think about things like a home range. In the winters, they're basically in lower elevation, less winter challenged sage shrubland environments. And then in the spring, they move up to higher elevation summer ranges. And during this transition, they're able to benefit more and exploit more nutritious forage as spring up happens as they move to their summer range. This is much of what's going on right now with these populations that we'll see. And as we do that, then we get into summer range, where the summer range throughout the several months that the deer are there provides more verdant green environment relative to where they would be within these lower elevation habitats that tend to dry out pretty much and start to senesce. Maybe they make it into the first week of July, maybe not. But again, and then part of the whole paradigm of this is that through these seasonal movements, moving from one habitat to the other, they're able to provide higher abundances relative to a more residential lifestyle if they just stayed in either the higher elevation summer habitats and had to deal with winter range in the winter, or stayed in the lower elevation sage habitats that are less productive within the summer as well. So this here is basically what some of these movements look like through time. So in the upper left, we have a little calendar. The blue dots are winter range. Deer will start to move into their migration that was shown by the green dots into their summer range, which is the yellow dots. All right. And they will stay here, raise their young, take part of that more nutritious, higher elevation range, and then start to move out as the cold descends, and then return back to their winter ranges in Idaho in winter. So this is pretty much a condensation of all the data that we've collected. We've been working with GPS data at Idaho Fish and Game since 2003. And I think this data set goes up to about 20 or 20. So we've kind of condensed it a little bit. The days are still explicit, but I condensed it so that everything occurs in the same year. So you can see, there's still some variability within here. So hopefully that you feel that it's genuine. From these movement patterns, what we're going to go, and I'm going to go into a pretty deep description of summer range habitat. We use these to basically, number one, determine what is summer range, and the summer range is determined by each individual deer's use of that and their seasonal movement patterns. Another thing that we garner from this information is that we're able to take this GPS data and we're able to measure how much an animal moves within each season, within winter or within summer. And we're able to quantify not just that GPS point, but the area surrounding that point. And this is kind of within each of our deer data analysis units here. We can basically figure out the average daily movement of that population. For example, if they were going 380 meters, we'd draw a buffer around that GPS point, and then we would measure how much of a specific forage type, not all forage types, but just each one in particular that is surrounding that point that they selected to be in at that time. And so this is kind of an important backdrop to these modeling scenarios, because I think everybody's familiar with being spatially specific, but these are also temporally specific. So we're trying to combine the conditions within 2007, which what occurred in 2007, and not these big averages across the year. When we start to look at these higher elevation landscapes, it's not going to be much of a surprise to folks in the Western United States where we have bark beetle infestation. So this is a picture in Stanley here, where you can start to see these brown trees starting to pop up as these trees, in essence, succumb to bark beetle infestation. This will spread and actually goes through entire stands, where you basically have a stand of dead wood ready to go. And lo and behold, whether it's a lightning strike or a careless kid with matches or somebody going out and leaving their campfire unattended, these fires come up and blow up into extreme size across the landscape in Idaho. And then again, just to kind of bring this a little bit back home to what I imagine the group is, we have large fire seasons within Idaho. We can have multiple fires going all at the same time. Within this picture from NASA, I believe, which was September 2022, we had 4 active fires producing smoke. And then from a remote sensing standpoint, not only do we have the destruction of the combustion going on, we also have the smoke that's clouding and masking further classifications of the satellite imagery that can occur that year or might be needed. So this is kind of the disturbance patterns we're dealing with. When we start to look at fire that occurs across Idaho, it's very prevalent here. This is from the MTSB database. And so these are all the fire perimeters that have occurred in Idaho 1985 to currently to 2023. And so these get updated annually. And when you start to look at this central area that we'll be going in and looking at depth with, you can actually see it's fairly large fire matrix here of different times and different things. And this is pretty important when we start to consider our main subject today, which is mule deer. So they don't necessarily consider these older forests as their best forage. Forage is what's happening below, their forage is accessible up to about 6 to 8 feet, depending if they stand on their hind legs or not. And so we're mostly concerned with this understory vegetation and its successional sequence through time for mule deer. So it's kind of these early to middle successional sequences that are actually the most benefit to mule deer. This brings us down into existing vegetation type. And so this is a screenshot of Idaho. I believe this is a 2023 EVT classification. Going by the full classification scheme, I think we have over about, I think the last count was 158 different vegetation classes with descriptions. We're a smaller state agency. We kind of have to break things down a little bit. So we put this into a forage, an 18-class forage classification system where the big ones are aspen woodlands, riparian, other deciduous forests, juniper, evergreen forests, mahogany woodlands. We'll get into mahogany a little bit later. Deciduous shrublands. This is one of the main a big forage factor for deer and elk, as well as sagebrush shrubland, xeric shrub, wet meadow, mesic grasslands, xeric grasslands, invasive grasslands, which we'll also touch on a little bit later, and then anthropogenic agriculture and developed areas. This unavailable is kind of this class that we put most things that are either unavailable to ungulates or they just don't really have vegetation on them. Things like lava flows, talus slopes, these things, and as well as open water. So that's kind of a description of how we start to digest this information coming in. So as we get into some of these models here, basically we're using a random forest design, classification design. This has a long history going back to the mid-90s in remote sensing. And then we use some covariate selection techniques. As I said, they were kind of, we're trying to make these models more temporally specific. So both seasonally within the summer or the winter, but then also kind of get the conditions which that animal at that time occurred associated with that particular point, not averages through time, but trying to get more specific. And this is kind of where the steps of EVT and its classification come through: 2001, 2008, 2010, 12, 14, 16, on all the way up to 2023. And habitats change through time. So we're going to go through successional sequences within this habitat where the older forests that lack forage are going to have fires going to move through, and that these are going to senesce into your earlier grass and shrub phases, which are much more nutritional benefit through time. And then again, as I mentioned before, we coordinate these movements both on what we see with the deer occurring for that season, but then also within these kind of data analysis units that we have across the state of Idaho. So we are a big enough state where we will see differences in the way that animals adapt both in time to the season, as well as their movement patterns as we start to look with it. Got a long list of covariates that go into these models, all of kind of the forage habitat classes that are derived from EVT that we talked about across this time span. Topography, we don't use elevation, but we use terrain roughness and some aspect stuff. We also put in some inherent kind of cues as far as annual variation. We measure NDVI, both the maximum that was recorded at a pixel as well as what accumulated across those summer dates. And those summer dates aren't chosen by us, but they're chosen by the mule deer from, again, this analysis of when they're moving about. And then as well as the disturbances that have occurred. One thing that we'll get into today, and this is just a little bit technical, is how we're going to have some boundaries, and we're going to take some of our raster data that's kind of grayscale and we're going to say yes or no, whether it's summer habitat or not. And we do this basically through a receiver operator characteristics plot, rock plots. And basically, if you were up here in this corner, this is one, that would mean you're perfect between your ratio of true positive to false positives. And so this point where you have a tangent line is what we're using to say, all right, at least statistically, this is where we can draw a line that says what's summer range and what's not. All right, we call that the best threshold value. And so this is kind of what some of our deer analysis units look like throughout the state. Each of these black lines outlines one of the data analysis units. And here we'll have some comparisons what's occurred in Smokey-Boise, which is really what we'll focus in on. And we'll have some relative comparisons to over here in the Caribou. The differences between these two and this came out kind of within that picture of the fire perimeter data from MTSB. Basically, between 1984 and 2024, we've recorded over 361 fires that have occurred in the Smokey-Boise DAU, one that's more central mountainous in the state. It's consumed over a third of the area in that time. And we can compare this to another one, the Caribou, which is kind of the southern extent of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, less fire disturbances, conifers succeeding aspen groves. We also kind of have a shot of monsoon rains in late August. But again, only about a little over 7% of this was consumed by fire. And this also kind of gets reflected in how the deer select for their summer range habitats. We're here within the Smokey-Boise deer analysis units. We have evergreen forest, accumulated NDVI or vegetation growth, mesic sage shrubland, mesic grass, xeric sage shrublands, wet meadows, deciduous shrublands, that unavailable, those talus slopes, riparian, and then the amount of area burned within the past 10 years is also a factor. Whereas we go into the less fire-prone Caribou DAU, we see evergreen forest, the peak NDVI, aspen groves, mesic grass, deciduous and xeric shrubs, agriculture, and mesic sage shrublands, wet meadow, and unavailable are. So we see some differences here in what the animals are selecting for. And so what I'm going to show you is basically when we develop these models, we get them going and we start to apply them through time. This is basically a trajectory of what we see when we apply the model to the conditions that occurred that year, what we see. We have a small histogram right here that's measuring the amount of area that actually meets that critical threshold. So we start off at 2003. And we're going to zoom through time. And hopefully what you see here is that you see both the intensity of the forest and the extent of the summer range change through time. And so when we start to look at the amount of area through time, we also start to see some of these annual undulations that are going through, and we also see some bigger increases. And again, in my mind, these are very complicated models, but what this helps represent, or what this portrays, is these underlying successional sequences in forage quality that go through this one area across this time span. And basically, we stopped at 2021 is basically that was, you have to stop somewhere. You're always a little bit behind when the location data comes in, and that has to be organized, as well as the transition of some of the NASA satellites going from MODIS to VERS that brings in the other NDVI data that's used to coordinate this. So when we start to see this and this shifting and undulation through time, it also provides us some options and some better understanding of the history of these summer ranges through time. And it offers us other opportunities on how we can actually apply our management to actually conserve these summer habitat areas for mule deer. And so this is just one example where I could say that if an area turned out to be in summer range for 18 or 19 of the 19 years of analysis, call this core. Other areas that are kind of from the 13 years of the 19 years, we can call this a majority, sort of major, sort of summer range habitat. Other ones that occur above or slightly below 10 years or so, about the mid-range point. We can call them frequent, and other areas that infrequently occur or have dropped out of the system. And this also provides options to our managers, as well as a more in-depth knowledge of what's happening, to be able to use things like priority and strategize when they are asked to mitigate or make comments on some of these environments. And so kind of where we are right now, um, basically I'm using winter range here. I wanted to show you how we start out with these locations. Then we start to use these locations to data mine all of these covariates to get a better idea, and then that this results in basically these have been accepted for mule deer across the state. This is a map of our mule deer winter ranges that have occurred. It gives us a firm, scientifically backed way to actually define what we're calling is winter range across the state. And it also allows a little bit of extrapolation to areas where we don't necessarily have mule deer location data, but as you will see, like in this southeast corner, some of these areas we have to get into. Me and Rob are in our preliminary reviews of what's actually happening with summer range, again, across the whole state of Idaho, and we're in basically reviewing and modifying our summer range models as we go along, and we coordinate with our wildlife managers and our boots on the ground and people that really know this data. So that's kind of the main best thing I could think of how we use the existing vegetation type that LANDFIRE has provided through time, and how it's allowed us to have this dynamic understanding based on data coming in of what has happened with these critical ranges within Idaho. Kind of wanted to go through, I've played with the database a little frequently for my livelihood for a while. So I just wanted to show you some of the hurdles I've run into and have had to overcome. So some of these, and this is no real big problem. This is a problem basically with any large scale database that you're going to have multiple models on. But right here, though, is kind of these seams problems and how these transition and whether or not they reflect the reality on the ground. So right up here, we have, this is Boise, Idaho, very fast growing metropolitan area. Down here is Mountain Home, which is also seeing very expansive growth as Boise fills in. You don't really see lines this straight in nature, even if that is an elevational gradient right there. And so this is basically the line that would be between cheatgrass versus other more nutritious mesic sort of grassland foothills grasses, and right there. And it reflects all the way up when we start to go into some of our forage classifications and everything. So these are some of the things that we've run into problems to. It's a classical problem. There's ways to feather it and move it through to make it a little bit more, but that was one of the ones that we run into. This other one is more a problem with misclassification, but I think it's probably a unique problem to the way that I showed the models before, because these models are stacked up through time. They're not dependent on the most current classification, but they're dependent on the classifications that occurred way back in the early noughts and everything. So This is Idaho Falls. We're heading towards the east. Way over here, you're starting to enter some of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, higher elevation habitats. This is called Tix Creek. We own a wildlife management area right here. These red dots were originally classified as mahogany, mountain mahogany, within that for the basically the cutoff is about 2008 in those classifications. Our elk data for this area actually started and goes from about 2007 to 2009. So mountain mahogany is kind of peculiar in itself, especially in Idaho. If you go to the south, it has these larger tree-like structures. So it doesn't even really provide that much forage because most of it's above 8 foot in height. It does not lose most of its leaves during winter, so it also could be a forage, could be a different type of forage, like this part here that's more closer into the central mountains areas outside of Challis, Idaho, where it takes a small shrubby form. And so these small shrubs that the leaves aren't falling off provide both shelter and a little bit of nominal forage. I don't know if we have much forage in the winter anywhere. Most of the animals are just eating to keep the engines running at that point in time. But so the situation was that we ran into. So we have our location data that's being associated with the classifications that were done saying that this was mountain mahogany within this area. We sent folks out in the field. It wasn't mountain mahogany. LANDFIRE also, through its classifications, come about the 2016 revision, noticed, hey, this isn't mountain mahogany, and then revised that classification. But due to the unique circumstances of this model occurring back in 2007, they trained our model. They said our model was things we're looking for mountain mahogany that was in that area. We try to put it within a more current context with the 2023 data, and there's no mahogany on there. So we lose that winter range even and that misclassification, even though it occurred in the early noughts, which we're really not thinking about too much, it projected itself through time. So what we ended up doing is going back for this specific analysis unit, and we took the 2016 data and we transposed it back on the 2008 data, and that worked for this situation for these elk. Fire. And so this next one is going to come up to an area that is quite like this seminal photo of elk in a river as a fire goes by. It comes from the South Fork of the Payette River. And basically, this is a recovering landscape, okay? This area is packed with elk. It has one of the highest, most dense populations of elk that we have available within Idaho along this river valley bottom. As this area has gone through fire disturbances and has seen some succession through time, basically we see this is the classification which through our digestion into a forage class turns out to be a wet meadow. And within other areas within the state, a wet meadow is actually accurate. This just gets you to see kind of what's underneath this a little bit for these wet meadow areas. And basically, with my field work, with the way that we think about things in Idaho, wet meadows are kind of, they don't have steep slopes like this that you can see through this topographic map that actually shows the topographic differences that are going on right here. And so that's not to say that there's There'll be an occasional seep or something in the side of a hill. This is common. And you could have some wet meadow vegetation that's usually around this, but it's really not as extensive as this in covering these areas. So this is another area that we kind of have to go back, and it is more of a regional vicinity thing that I have to apply the correction to put this into other classes. And those other classes could be mesic grass, deciduous shrub, mesic shrub, within that sort of fire disturbance trajectory that is prevalent within these habitats and stuff. And so these are just some of the things. I think this might be kind of very interesting to the LANDFIRE group because, at least from my understanding, when we start seeing the annual upgrades or have seen the annual upgrades within the EVT and other products classification, fire and disturbances are kind of one of the triggers that would say, hey, let's do some more intensive classification in these areas. So kind of bring it into some summary here. We use existing vegetation types for statewide analyses, for seasonal range habitats for mule deer, elk, and pronghorn. And so when these are all said and done and reviewed and put onto the paper, these will be products that are provided by Idaho Department of Fish and Game, hopefully from stem to stern where that species occur. We're able to mine our historic location databases to do this, and the existing vegetation type has been fundamental towards this. And again, this is a unique personal view of this and how this modeling works, but the history of the LANDFIRE database and EVT is almost just as important and often understated. And this is actually how me and Megan started talking again, because what I had seen is like all of a sudden the 2001 databases got archived and I no longer had that direct backup that I could click on to make sure of things. And so she showed me where to find it and everything else with the organization, and that goes. But very, very critical database in this sort of change analysis that we're able to do is absolutely dependent on that. And then another thing is some of these problems or these corrections, this isn't all of them. It's some of them that I thought would be good to go over. We're Idaho Department of Fish and Game. These are our stomping grounds. We're able to get to some of these areas and probably could get data back to some of the folks classifying these data to make some corrections on there. I'm not saying that we're going to be able to provide line transects of the vegetation on the ground and directly overset, but we're able to get there. We're able to take some photographs and we're able to feed that back to show people what's going on. And then I guess also it's worth mentioning within the times right now, kind of the way that we're using this right now. This is for an economically important iconic species of the Western United States. And so Idaho, it's very important, but it's not just Idaho, it's Utah, it's Montana, it's Wyoming. So these types of analyses that this type of the existing vegetation type provides for, that's kind of an important factor, and it's not necessarily it might be synonymous with some of the atmosphere we're living through today and everything. And so I thought that was an important point. So from here, I was kind of saying like this would be a good spot to kind of let conversations go, and I'm open for questions and everything else if we want to do so right now.
Megan, I have one, and I always forget how to raise my hand in all these different things we work in. Scott, first, amazing work, incredible work, and really impressive presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not a wildlife person, so I got a lot out of it. But I had a sort of a question, a couple of things for you. Is I was going to ask you to summarize some of the problems you had and provide them to the program, because that's something that we may be able to use in the future to improve. So you already said that you were in a good position to do that. So I'm hoping that you will, do that for us. And the more site specific you can be, the better. Real examples so that we can look at the imagery and the data that we have and things like that to see how we might do better. Okay, so that was one. But really, I was kind of interested in your 18 class classification, because you started off with 100 and something, I forget how many, and you winnowed it down to 18, which I know can be very difficult. So did you have like a group that did this, or did you end up having to do that yourself? And
Well, I played a lion's share role in this, and then and somewhat out of spite, I call it the Hurley Forage Vegetation Classification. So that's after Mark Hurley, who gave me this task upon working with fish and game. At first, it was just the southern part of the state, basically those areas that would be south of the Salmon River, and then we extended it much up north and then out a little ways within the neighboring states to try to include areas where I think at that time the interest was just ungulates and their forage going in there. And it's always kind of this continuous process. There's always going to be some revisions, and it's just always kind of, it kind of comes in with the one example I had with the mountain mahogany and the elk for that specific area in Tex Creek. The correction got done by on the LANDFIRE side of things. The correction didn't get done retroactively, and then it actually, our modeling structure, trying to be more specific through time, is what actually caused the problem and how. So we're still learning. We've worked a lot with folks in Montana who had a similar. They also, even though they might be doing a little bit more secretively, their Fish, Wildlife, and Parks also digests a lot of LANDFIRE EVT data to put it within their specific classifications that they think are important for the species that they have to do. So, yeah, I got stuck. I didn't get stuck, but I did a lot of it by myself. But then I also had some times where I was able to interface with people that had their boots on the ground for a number of years and actually knew the areas that these were being projected to. I'm pretty willing, Jim, if we want to go back and forth with what goes into what classes and how that works, I'd be willing to share that. But on the other hand, it kind of starts to fall off, I guess, within the western portions of the Great Basin as well as the southern portions, where we start to see some of these creosote bush habitats start to come in, where we start to see some of the scab lands within Oregon and Washington start to play. So, I'm lucky I live in Idaho, so that's kind of my defense. It's like, well, they don't send me out enough.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more time, but I did want to say if you'd share that, because we have found that people want to classify and group differently, and it helps us understand what people are running into by seeing how they group the data. Because not many people need it at the ecological system level, at the native level.
Yeah.
But everybody does it differently. So seeing how you did it would be helpful to us. So
yeah, no, and again, this is a very ungulate forage focus, and so we know we have blinders on and everything else.
Thanks, Scott. I have a question from our LANDFIRE program lead, Henry Bastian. If LANDFIRE were not available to you, what would you use? And the second part of that question is, how important do you feel LANDFIRE is to your work?
Yeah, I think hopefully that my presentation just shows, like I said, the existing vegetation type database is fundamentally critical to our analysis and the information we're able to provide for the management of this economically important iconic species. That goes within the deeper analysis as well as the projections of what the estimates are currently. The way that this model is set up, it kind of will go on forever as long as our location data comes in. We'll always be getting new locations. As far as I can tell, we'll always be having new fires that occur each year. The landscape will continuously change through time. And that's our charge, is how do we maintain it? How do we maintain these populations? How do we maintain these opportunities for the sportswomen and the sportsmen, as well as the wildlife in Idaho? The next thing that even comes remotely close would be something like NLCD. And we've gone through a lot of iterations with this. We've done GAP, we've done REGAP, and we've done shrub map. You know, GAP and REGAP were really great for forested systems. They were abysmal when you got down into some of these lower elevation sage, xeric grassland habitats and everything else like that. Also, and I was kind of thinking about it a little bit later last night. There used to be this huge chasm between BLM and USGS versus USDA and the Forest Service. And you would see these great chasms and divides between the different classifications that they use there. And so I hope that kind of, I mean, I'm indebted to it. We're talking a several year project to develop this that has used this. Like I said, so we're very, 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 very dependent. I don't know how much more dependent I can show myself as being. The other alternatives, there are some out there. They're not as good, and they are not as accurate for ungulate forage. You know, their physiognomic classes, having to know what's underneath is kind of what we're really interested in.
Thanks. Hey, Scott. So great. I learned a lot, just as Jim said. I'm not a wildlife person, so it was really fascinating. I was curious in terms of looking into the future, is modeling potential future vegetation patterns a part of your work, you know, in terms of projected fire or climate or anything like that? And if so, how do you do that, or how would you like to do that? I'm kind of hinting at, I'd like to help think of how we might help you or what kind of modeling LANDFIRE might contribute to. We do a lot of state and transition modeling and that sort of thing. So I was just curious about that. We don't per se, as you know, do any climate change work that we deliver on LANDFIRE to go, but I know looking forward is probably a part of the management work. So curious how you deal with that.
Yeah, I think we're on good grounds. This has always been something that I think about a lot. Within the study area that we've shown here, and within the fire disturbance regimes that have occurred since the mid-'80s, we are seeing a significant transition away from closed canopy evergreen forests into a more open shrubland landscape. This has benefited mule deer. Within the examples, we've seen there's more habitat available for them now than, say, there was in 2003. This isn't too far in with some of predictive models going into the future that have been done with some of my colleagues from NASA. I won't name them, but you can, where there will be a transition away from kind of closed canopy forest systems into a more open, shrubby sort of system. I think that the data that's directly available at hand starts to document what some of these transitions could look like within a less publicized atmosphere, specifically what's happening within the Central Mountains, within Idaho, within the past 40 years, because that's how long our data streams go. from my previous work, that's kind of the best ground footing that you can be on, is when you have that really hardcore data. This species within this environment depends on this. This is how it's shifted through time. This is how this species has adapted to that. And I think when you're able to establish that firm fundamental scientifically based understanding, you're on the best grounds you could be to make these transitions into the future. So we entertain these things. We work a lot with students of Utah State University, as well as Idaho, University of Idaho, and a lot of my work is on migration that has been with the University of Wyoming and their migration initiative. So yes, whether something's formal, whether the money's there for that duration, for that period of time, whether or not it gets realistic, those are kind of, that's the arena you get to play in. But I feel strongly that we have the data to be able to do so.
Really interesting. Thank you, Scott. A lot of the issues that you brought up with EVT are sort of known issues in the program. What kind of, do you see any availability of funding or programs that would help LANDFIRE be able to essentially backcast consistent methods through time? Because I think we've wanted to do that, but we just, our emphasis has been on current updates and getting those right, rather than sort of backcasting with imagery using current methods. And so, do you see any opportunities there? I mean, I think that's one of the things everybody wants, but we don't have the funding.
Yeah, I've had some deep thoughts on this, and so they almost get philosophical, and I think I don't think it would be uncommon that, well, let's get it right from this point going forward.
Right.
And so I think that's correcting the problem. But then, well, with my I grew up in New Jersey and I had a vibrant youth. So I was like, how do I go back and fix all those problems? It's a little bit deeper. I think for me, from trying to manipulate the data, backcasting by a very simple, grab this here, put it here, make these different changes. It's specific for that class, for that species within that area. It wouldn't even have worked if we moved it over to another data analysis unit, because it would have a different function. So I know of no funding sources available to go back and correct. I think there's advice. I think there's ways to go about providing methodology to meet these certain situations. I don't know whether or not, and I'd really be open to, your view and with a broader audience for folks that are doing some sort of change analysis. Would something like that work? Could you get some sort of, side blog, methods blog, GitHub going on to entertain to where you could actually point these people in the right direction, not necessarily for their exact specific needs, but somebody that came across this problem, this is how they did it. I'm always suspect of necessarily providing the exact code, because pretty much by the time you figure it out, you download it, you get it, you augment it, you get it on your computer, the landscape has changed and you got to learn something new. But we all know how to juggle that way through life, I guess. And so, I don't know. I wish.
No, I mean, it's interesting how your perspective, because I do feel that it is a regional, when we map EVT, we do it on smaller, units. And so it is very kind of customized to the place, and yeah.
That would be the one thing. And Idaho is an incredibly diverse place, and at times I think I'm the luckiest guy on earth to be able to live in Idaho, just because we have everything from high mountain deserts all the way up to temperate rainforests in the north. So extremely diverse. But then kind of like again, some of these other problem examples with the seams is like, I'm not saying publicize the seams, but having that data available for those that would want to correct them could actually help folks out a lot. And because within that example I used with fire and then the music meadows coming back within those areas, and being an old remote sensor, I could very well understand that, in summer, you're going to get wet grass because otherwise it's a big cloud or smoke, and you're very limited on your image quality coming in. But again, if you could isolate where that model works and operates, then I could apply corrections just to that part of LANDFIRE within that section. That doesn't affect the other classes where that model is working correctly to get that identification. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit too technical, but that's kind of what I ended up doing by hand, but that's how I did it.
Gotcha. Well, thanks for your insight. Appreciate it.